Right now, in the back hangars and conference rooms of regional charter operations across the country, there are accountants staring at spreadsheets that would make most people's eyes water. Not because the numbers are bad necessarily, but because the numbers tell a story that took years to fully materialize, and now that it's sitting right there in black and white, the full weight of what the surviving charter operators actually went through to build the fleets they're flying today is impossible to ignore. Acquisitions that looked predatory at the time, mergers that looked defensive, asset purchases out of bankruptcy that looked opportunistic. All of it compressed into a roughly 5-year window that fundamentally reshaped who controls charter lift in this country, what they paid for it, and what the balance sheets they're carrying look like now that the consolidation wave has actually crested and started pulling back. That's what today is about. The consolidation wave in the charter operator space is over, or close enough to over, that we can start doing the forensics on it. Who won, who lost, who survived but at a cost that might take years to fully reckon with, and what the actual acquisition prices, fleet values, and financial structures underneath those deals looked like when you strip away the press release language and look at what actually changed hands, and for how much. Because there's a version of this story that gets told in aviation trade press that's mostly about strategic vision and market positioning and leadership teams making bold moves. And then there's the version of this story that lives in the actual deal terms, the debt loads, the maintenance reserves, the deferred capital expenditures, and the per-tail acquisition costs that the acquirers are now responsible for, and those two versions of the story are meaningfully different. Before we get into the details, hit subscribe because this is exactly the kind of financial and operational breakdown of the business aviation industry that most channels simply don't do, and if you want to understand where charter pricing, fleet economics, and operator consolidation are actually headed for the next several years rather than what the marketing decks are saying, you're going to want to be here for every piece of this going forward. Let's start with why the consolidation happened in the first place, because understanding the pressures that created it is the only way to understand what the survivors actually bought and what they actually paid. Charter aviation has always been a fragmented business. For most of its commercial history, the market was dominated by regional operators running a handful of aircraft, often 10 tails or fewer, frequently built around a specific geographic market or a specific customer relationship base, sometimes literally built around a single corporate account that anchored the whole book of business. The economics of running a small charter operation were always tight. High fixed costs, regulatory overhead that scales badly at small size, maintenance exposure that can crater a quarter's financials if the wrong thing breaks at the wrong time, and a revenue stream that was always more volatile than it looked during good times, because the moment business travel softened, the discretionary charter customer was among the first to pull back. What changed in the years leading up to and during the consolidation wave was a combination of factors that hit simultaneously, and timing matters a lot in understanding why the deals that happened when they happened at the prices they did. The first factor was the pandemic-era demand spike, which you've heard about in every aviation context imaginable, but which hit the charter segment in a way that was particularly dramatic even within aviation. Commercial air travel collapsed. Corporate flight departments froze headcount and in many cases grounded part of their fleets. Private charter, meanwhile, experienced something close to a demand explosion from a buyer profile that had never seriously considered it before. People who were ordinarily traveling business class on commercial airlines, who now had both the financial means to consider charter and a very specific, fear-driven motivation to avoid shared cabin environments entirely. That new buyer segment flooded into charter in numbers the industry simply wasn't equipped to handle, and the operators who could find lift, any lift, at almost any price, were printing money in a way that hadn't been seen in the history of the segment. That demand spike did two things that are directly relevant to the consolidation story. First, it massively inflated the apparent value of charter operating certificates, existing customer relationships, and established fleets, the core assets that any acquirer would be buying. If an operator is running aircraft at 90% utilization and commanding pricing they'd never seen before, and you're trying to buy that operator, the price you have to pay for it reflects those metrics, even if you know somewhere in the back of your mind that those metrics aren't permanent. Second, it created an enormous incentive for capital that had been sitting on the sidelines of aviation: private equity, family offices, a few genuinely adventurous institutional investors, to decide that the charter market was finally the place to deploy, because the revenue numbers suddenly looked like they justified the operational complexity and regulatory overhead that had always scared capital away from this particular corner of aviation before. Put those two things together, and you get the conditions for exactly the kind of acquisition binge that followed. Capital looking for a home, operators showing remarkable revenue numbers, acquirers willing to pay multiples that reflected peak performance rather than cycle-adjusted averages, and sellers, many of them charter operators who'd been grinding through thin margins for years and suddenly found themselves being handed valuations they'd never have seen in normal times, who were more than willing to take the money and let someone else figure out what came next. That's the setup. Now let's talk about what the acquirers actually bought, because this is where the story gets complicated fast. A charter operator's real assets are fewer and less tangible than they look from the outside, and understanding that is essential to understanding why some of these acquisition prices look, in retrospect, dramatically different than they appeared when the deals were signed. The most obvious asset is the fleet itself, the actual physical aircraft, and the values of those aircraft during the peak of the consolidation wave were in a place nobody had ever seen before. Used jet values, particularly for the mid-cabin and super mid-size categories that form the workhorse of most serious charter fleets, had appreciated in ways that looked genuinely surreal to anyone who'd been tracking those markets for more than a few years. A mid-cabin twin that was worth $3 or $4 million in 2019 was trading at $5, $6, sometimes $7 million or more by 2021 and into 2022, depending on time, configuration, and how desperate the buyer was. Engines that were midlife were suddenly midlife at a dramatically higher book value. Avionics that were acceptable were now being called mandatory upgrades rather than optional improvements. So when an acquirer bought a charter operator at the peak of the cycle, the aircraft on that fleet were being valued at what the market said they were worth in that moment, which was a number built on conditions that were already beginning to ease by the time many of these deals actually closed. The legal process for acquiring a certificated air carrier, the regulatory filings, the FAA involvement, the insurance transitions, the employment contract negotiations, the customer notification requirements, is slow enough that deals that were conceived in peak demand conditions were sometimes closing into markets that had already started to soften, with fleet values marked at peak prices baked into the acquisition price and deal structure. The actual purchase prices for these acquisitions varied enormously based on fleet size, geographic reach, customer concentration, and how sophisticated the seller was about the negotiation. But looking across the landscape of publicly disclosed or industry-reported deals during the peak consolidation window, you see a recurring pattern. Acquirers were routinely paying somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times the book value of the fleet in total enterprise value, meaning the aircraft valuation was just the floor, and the additional value being assigned to the operating certificate, the customer book, the brand in a specific regional market, the management team, the maintenance relationships, and the regulatory history of the operation was substantial, and in some cases the majority of what was actually being purchased. For a mid-size regional operator running 10 to 15 jets with a decent customer base and clean regulatory history, that meant acquisition prices in the range of $50 to $100 million or more, depending on fleet composition. For the larger acquisitions that defined the really dramatic consolidation plays, operators running 25, 30 or more aircraft across multiple bases, the numbers were in the hundreds of millions, and in a few cases, for the platform acquisitions that effectively created new national competitors, you were talking about something approaching or exceeding $1 billion in total enterprise value when you added in the debt being assumed and the forward commitments being taken on. Those are extraordinary numbers for a business that, even at peak utilization, was generating margins that most industries would not consider exceptional. Charter aviation is a high-revenue, high-cost business. The revenue per flight hour is impressive until you look at what it costs to generate it. Between aircraft ownership or lease costs, crew compensation and training, maintenance, fuel, insurance, dispatch and operations infrastructure, and the regulatory compliance burden that doesn't go away just because you grew by acquisition. Net margins in charter, even in good times, have typically been in the single digits for most operators, and the acquirers buying at the prices they were paying during peak consolidation were implicitly betting that they could either dramatically expand those margins through scale, or that the demand conditions that were inflating both revenue and asset values would persist long enough for the deal math to work. Both of those bets have proven harder to win than the deal memos suggested, and that's where we get into the really interesting part of what the survivors actually paid. Let's talk about the specific cost layers, because the headline acquisition price is only the beginning of what these consolidations actually cost the buyers, and the layers underneath it are often where the real financial pain ended up living. The first and most immediate layer beyond the purchase price is what I'll call the integration tax. When you buy a charter operator, you are acquiring, along with its aircraft and its customers, its systems, its culture, its contracts, its compliance history, its maintenance programs, and its workforce. None of those things automatically become compatible with your existing operation on day 1, or day 90, or sometimes ever, without significant investment and disruption. Flight operations manuals have to be reconciled, maintenance programs have to be merged, or at minimum cross-referenced. Software systems for dispatch, scheduling, maintenance tracking, and customer relationship management, which in this industry are frequently a patchwork of legacy tools that the original operator built around, have to be evaluated, integrated, or replaced, and every hour the operations team is spending on integration is an hour they're not spending on running flights and managing the customer relationships that justified the acquisition in the first place. The actual dollar cost of integration for a mid-sized charter acquisition is hard to pin down precisely because it shows up across so many different budget lines, but experienced operators who've been through it put the number at somewhere between 5 and 15% of the acquisition price, on top of the headline number, which on a $50 million deal is an additional $2.5 to $7.5 million in real cash that flows out the door over the 12 to 24 months following the deal close. For the larger, more complex acquisitions, where you're trying to merge two meaningful operating cultures and two sets of FAA operational specifications, the integration cost can run higher, and the timeline can stretch well beyond 2 years before the combined operation is running with anything like the efficiency the deal model assumed. The second cost layer is what I'd call the deferred maintenance reckoning, and this is the one that genuinely surprised some acquirers who thought they'd done adequate due diligence going in. Charter operators under financial pressure, and the charter operators that ended up being acquisition targets, were frequently operators that were either struggling with the capital requirements of scaling or operators whose founders wanted liquidity, have a systematic incentive to defer maintenance expenditures that can legally be deferred. Not unsafe deferral necessarily, but the scheduling of inspections, the timing of engine enrollments on power-by-the-hour programs, the decisions about when to do interior refurbishments and avionics upgrades that are genuinely needed, but genuinely deferrable for a year or two. When you run a fleet that way for several years heading into a sale, you create what operators call a maintenance step-up problem. The acquiring operator gets the benefit of a fleet that looks, on paper, compliant and current, but inherits a forward maintenance profile that is much heavier than the average would suggest, because all the deferred work is still out there waiting to be done, and it's going to show up in the first several years of post-acquisition ownership. For acquirers who properly stress-tested the maintenance records during due diligence and modeled the forward cost conservatively, this was a manageable surprise. For acquirers who were moving fast in a competitive deal process, and the consolidation wave was full of competitive deal processes where sellers had multiple bidders, and who didn't have the time or the access to properly analyze every tail's actual forward maintenance exposure, this was sometimes a genuinely painful reckoning. Engine events that the deal model assumed were 2 or 3 years out turned out to be 18 months out. Airframe inspections that the seller characterized as recently completed turned out to have conditions noted that were being managed rather than resolved. Interior and avionics refresh costs that weren't in the acquisition model showed up in the second year of ownership as customer-driven requirements that couldn't be deferred any further without losing the business the acquisition was supposed to capture. Across the portfolio of consolidation deals that happened at the peak of the wave, the deferred maintenance problem probably added, on average, between 10 and 20% to the effective cost of the fleet over the first 3 years post-acquisition. concentrated in the operators who were running the most hours pre-sale and who had the most motivation to manage their maintenance spend tightly in the 12 to 18 months before going to market. That's not a small number on deals that were already priced at aggressive multiples. The third cost layer is crew, and it's the one that's gotten the most attention publicly because of how visible the aviation crew shortage was during the period when most of these deals were happening. The aircraft in a charter fleet are, on one level, just aluminum and avionics, until you have qualified pilots sitting in the front seats who are current, type-rated, and able to carry revenue passengers legally. The consolidation wave happened simultaneously with the most severe professional pilot shortage this country has seen in a generation, driven by a collision of retirements, training pipeline capacity constraints, military sourcing competition, and the simultaneous demand recovery of commercial aviation, which was aggressively recruiting from exactly the same pilot pool the charter industry was trying to staff. When an acquirer bought a charter operation during the consolidation wave, they frequently bought an operation whose crew retention was tied to compensation structures, culture, and ownership relationships that simply didn't survive the acquisition. Pilots who had been with a small regional operator for years, who had a personal relationship with the founder operator, and had accepted below-market compensation partly on the basis of that relationship and the flexibility of a smaller operation, were suddenly working for a larger, more process-driven organization with different scheduling norms, different management culture, and frequently a compensation package that had been negotiated as part of the acquisition cost rather than re-benchmarked to what the actual pilot market was paying at peak shortage. The predictable result was turnover, and at the cost of hiring, training, and bringing to currency a new charter pilot. Type rating costs for cabin-class jets can run $30,000 to $50,000 or more per pilot, depending on aircraft type, and that's before you factor in the time during which the new hire is not yet generating revenue. High post-acquisition crew turnover was a genuinely expensive problem. Some operators lost a third or more of the acquired operations pilot workforce within the first year post-close, and replacing that talent at market rates in the tightest pilot market in recent history cost far more than any deal model had contemplated when it was built 18 or 24 months earlier. The cost of crew churn, when you add up the direct training expense, the revenue disruption from reduced staffing, the increased premium flying required to cover gaps with contract crews at rates that were sky-high during the shortage, and the productivity hit to operations management that was spending time recruiting and onboarding rather than running the business, was probably the single biggest underestimated cost in the consolidation wave, and it disproportionately hit the acquirers who moved fastest and didn't have a thoughtful crew integration plan ready at deal close. The fourth cost layer is customer concentration risk, which sounds like a due diligence concept rather than a direct cost, but which turned into a very direct cost for operators who discovered it the hard way post-acquisition. A meaningful share of the regional charter operators that became acquisition targets during the consolidation wave had customer books that were far more concentrated than they appeared on first look. A mid-sized charter operator reporting strong annual charter revenue might, underneath that headline number, have somewhere between 30 and 50% of its total revenue attributable to 2 or 3 anchor relationships, a family office that accounts for a significant chunk of hours, a law firm or financial services operation that places steady recurring bookings, a few high-net-worth individuals who fly consistently enough that the operator has essentially built its scheduling model around their demand. Those relationships were frequently personal, built over years of service, often directly tied to the relationship between the customer and the founder-operator, who was now, post-acquisition, cashed out and no longer involved in the day-to-day. When those relationships followed the founder out the door, rather than transferring cleanly to the acquiring operation, the revenue impact was immediate and in some cases severe. A customer who had flown 200 hours a year because they trusted a specific person and a specific operation doesn't automatically transfer their loyalty to the new corporate parent that bought the trade name. Some did, with proper transition planning. Many didn't, particularly for the acquirers who moved quickly and underinvested in the customer retention phase immediately post-close. For operators who lost a major anchor customer in the first year post-acquisition, the financial impact was essentially additive to everything else on this list. They'd paid an acquisition price that reflected the revenue that anchor customer represented, they were carrying the integration costs and the maintenance step-up and the crew churn, and now they were doing all of that with a revenue base that was materially smaller than the one the deal was priced on. That's a deeply unpleasant place to be, and it describes a meaningful number of the acquisitions made during the peak of the consolidation wave. Now let's talk about what the actual fleet-level economics look like for the survivors, because this is where the long-tail consequences of the acquisition pricing are going to play out over the next several years, in ways that are already starting to be visible. The aircraft values that formed the foundation of most of these acquisitions have moved significantly from where they were at the peak, not collapsed. This isn't a story of charter jet values falling off a cliff, but corrected meaningfully, and in some categories quite substantially, from the peaks that were set during the post-pandemic demand frenzy. A mid-cabin jet that was marked on an operator's balance sheet at a peak valuation when the acquisition was done is now worth demonstrably less in the resale market, and for operators who leverage their fleet as collateral against acquisition financing, that change in collateral value matters very directly to their banking relationships. The financing structures on these acquisitions ranged significantly, but a common pattern involved a combination of acquisition debt secured against the fleet, mezzanine or subordinated debt that was priced to reflect the risk that the senior lenders didn't want to take, and in some cases, equity that was genuinely thin relative to the enterprise value being financed, because the acquirers in the competitive deal environment were trying to maximize returns if the bull case played out. That kind of leverage structure works beautifully when the assets hold their value and the cash flows are strong. It creates real problems when asset values have corrected, demand has normalized from peak levels, and the integration costs have been higher and slower to recede than the model assumed. For the most aggressively structured acquisitions in the consolidation wave, the reckoning has already started arriving. Some operators are in quiet renegotiations with lenders about covenant compliance. Some are looking at fleet dispositions, selling tails to reduce debt load rather than for strategic reasons, at prices that are below what those aircraft were valued at in the acquisition transaction, which is a painful double hit on a balance sheet that was already stretched. A few have already been through formal restructuring of some kind, and while the certificated operations themselves have generally continued, because a charter certificate with customer relationships and trained crews is genuinely valuable even to a distressed acquirer, the original equity holders in some of these deals are looking at returns that are dramatically below what the investment thesis promised when the checks were written. For the survivors who are in genuinely better shape, the story is still more complicated than the press release version suggests, and the differences between the survivors who are positioned well and the ones who are carrying excess weight tell you a lot about what the actual winning playbook looked like during the consolidation wave. The operators who came through the best, looking at their cost basis and their current financial structure together, generally share a few specific characteristics that are worth understanding, not just as history, but because they define what competitive advantage actually looks like in the post-consolidation landscape. The first is that they were disciplined about valuation. Discipline at the deal level. The acquirers who are in the best shape today are the ones who, even in the competitive deal environment of peak consolidation, maintained a model that assumed demand would normalize and asset values would correct, and who were willing to walk away from deals that only penciled at peak cycle assumptions. In a frothy deal environment, walking away is hard. You watch competitors close deals you passed on and generate the short-term results that come from buying into a rising market, and there's enormous institutional pressure to keep pace. The operators who resisted that pressure and either stayed out of specific deals or negotiated hard enough on price to maintain downside protection are the ones who aren't in covenant conversations with their lenders right now. The second characteristic is a genuinely thoughtful approach to crew and customer retention from day one of the acquisition, not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of the deal planning. This meant things that cost money up front, retention bonuses for key pilots that were structured into the acquisition cost, customer outreach programs that started before deal close rather than after, management continuity provisions that kept founder operators involved in some capacity for long enough to genuinely transfer relationships rather than just sign papers and disappear. Those costs were real. They showed up in deal structures as earnouts, retention pools, and transition service agreements that added to the headline cost of the acquisition. But they dramatically reduced the churn costs on the back end, and the operators who paid them are flying more of the original customer base and retaining more of the original crew capacity than the operators who tried to economize on transition and discovered the cost of losing those relationships the hard way. The third characteristic is fleet rationalization discipline, the consolidation wave, particularly for the larger platform acquirers who were rolling up multiple operations simultaneously, created fleets that were in some cases genuinely inefficient from a type diversity standpoint. When you acquire three separate operators, and each of them was running a slightly different mix of aircraft types, you end up with a fleet that might have multiple types, for which you have small numbers of aircraft, a small number of qualified crews, and high training cost per crew member, relative to what you'd carry if you flew a more standardized fleet. The operators who recognized this quickly and made the hard decisions to exit certain types, even at prices that were below their book value acquisition cost, and rationalize around the types where they could build genuine crew and maintenance scale, were faster to get their operating cost structure down to sustainable levels. The ones who kept every tail from every acquisition because selling at a loss felt too painful are still carrying the overhead of that type diversity in their training and maintenance spend. Let's talk about the actual numbers for a minute in a more granular way, because even within the general framework we've laid out, the specifics by aircraft category tell an important part of this story. The light jet category, your Phenom 100 and 300 equivalents, your Citation CJs, the entry-level jets that form the workhorse of the transient charter market, saw some of the most dramatic demand and pricing volatility during the cycle, and consequently some of the most significant post-peak corrections. These aircraft at peak were being acquired by consolidators for values that in some cases approached 80 or 90% of original manufacturer list price for well-equipped, fairly recent vintage aircraft, which is extraordinary for an asset category that historically depreciated meaningfully in its first several years. Some of the wholesale acquisitions of light jet fleets during 2021 and 2022 were done at per-tail prices of $2.5 to $3.5 million for aircraft that had been purchased new for $3 to $4 million, meaning years of ownership had essentially generated zero or even negative depreciation benefit for the original operator. Those same aircraft, today, are trading in a range that is measurably below those peak levels, and the operators who built business plans around fleet values holding at peak are managing that decline in collateral value while simultaneously dealing with all the other post-acquisition pressures we've already described. The good news for the light jet survivors is that charter demand for the light jet category, while it has normalized from peak frenzy, remains genuinely solid. The customer base that discovered light charter during the pandemic and incorporated it into their travel habits has proven somewhat stickier than the bears expected, and the revenue per flight hour has not collapsed to pre-pandemic levels. The math is manageable for the well-capitalized operators. For the thin equity acquirers who overpaid for light jet fleets at peak, it is considerably more challenging. The mid-cabin and super mid-size category, the Citation Latitudes, the Challenger 350s, the Gulfstream G280s and their competitive set, the aircraft that form the backbone of the serious charter operators' revenue generation, tells a somewhat different story, because this category had stronger structural demand underpinnings and somewhat more disciplined manufacturing supply than the light jet market. The acquirers in this category were paying, at the peak, per-tail values in the $8 to $14 million range depending on vintage and time, which represented meaningful premiums over where these aircraft had been trading just 2 years earlier. Those values have corrected, but more moderately than the light jet category, and the charter revenue per flight hour in this category has remained strong enough that operators with reasonable leverage and sound operating execution are able to service their acquisition debt at current aircraft values, though with less headroom than the original deal models assumed. The heavy jet and large cabin category, Globals, large Gulfstreams, Falcons in the large cabin configuration, represents the most dramatic individual transaction values in the consolidation wave, with individual aircraft sometimes valued at $20 to $30 million or more during the peak, and fleet-level acquisitions of heavy jet charter operations sometimes reaching into nine-figure territory on their own. This is also the category where the insurance and crew costs are highest, where the maintenance exposure per event is most significant, and where the customer relationship concentration risk is most acute, because the heavy jet charter customer base is smaller and more personal relationship-driven than the mid-cabin market. Consolidators who made acquisitions in this category at peak pricing are dealing with all of the same pressures as the mid-cabin operators, but at a scale where each individual decision, to sell a tail, to exit a customer relationship, to restructure a maintenance program, has larger dollar consequences. There's a specific dynamic in the heavy jet charter consolidation that's worth naming directly, which is the role of the management fee structure in how many of these large cabin operations were actually structured. A significant portion of the heavy jets operating on charter certificates in this country aren't owned by the operator. They're managed aircraft, owned by high-net-worth individuals or family offices who have placed their aircraft into a charter management program. The operator earns a management fee and a share of the charter revenue, while the aircraft owner carries the depreciation, the maintenance, and the ownership costs. That structure looks like a great arrangement for the operator during a demand boom. You get revenue and management fees without carrying the asset on your balance sheet, but it introduces a risk that consolidation-era acquirers didn't always fully model, which is that the managed aircraft owner can exit the arrangement when the charter market softens or when the operator changes hands. When a consolidation acquirer buys a charter operation and changes the management team, the culture, the pricing strategy, or the brand, some portion of the managed aircraft owners in that fleet will decide this is a good moment to reassess their management agreement. Maybe they move the aircraft to a competing management program. Maybe they decide to pull the aircraft off charter entirely. Either way, the acquiring operator loses not just the revenue from those specific aircraft, but the effective capacity those tails provided, which was part of what justified the scale premium in the acquisition price. For operators who lost a significant portion of their managed fleet in the first year or two post-acquisition, this was effectively a double cost. They'd paid for the revenue associated with those managed aircraft in the acquisition price, and now they were running a smaller effective fleet at a higher cost structure than the deal assumed. Okay, so having walked through all of that, the deal pricing, the integration costs, the maintenance step-ups, the crew and customer retention dynamics, the fleet value corrections, and the specific pressures by aircraft category, what does the landscape actually look like for the operators who survived the consolidation wave and are now running the businesses they assembled? The honest answer is more varied than either the bull or bear narrative about charter consolidation captures. There are genuinely well-positioned survivors in this market, operators who made disciplined acquisitions, managed their integration thoughtfully, built real-scale efficiencies in their maintenance and crew infrastructure, and are now flying a customer base that has normalized from peak frenzy levels, but remains meaningfully larger than it was pre-pandemic. Those operators have real competitive advantages that the smaller regional operators they consolidated have lost, technology platforms that smaller operators can't afford to build, safety management systems that are genuinely more sophisticated at scale, crew training programs and fleet standardization that reduce per-flight hour cost in ways that take years to build and can't be replicated overnight. The consolidation wave, for these survivors, produced something real and durable, even if the process of building it cost more than the original models suggested. Then there are the operators who are survivors in the narrow sense of the word. The certificate is still active, the aircraft are still flying, the customer base still exists, but whose financial structure is carrying the weight of peak cycle acquisitions in a way that is going to constrain their strategic options for years. They can't make new acquisitions because they're already leveraged. They're managing fleet dispositions more reactively than strategically. Their management bandwidth is disproportionately consumed by lender relationships and debt covenant management rather than customer development and competitive positioning. These operators are surviving but not thriving, and the question of whether they ultimately emerge from this period as genuinely competitive independent operators or become the next round of acquisition targets for better capitalized buyers is very much open. And then there's a third group that's harder to see clearly from the outside but is real. Operators who went through the consolidation process discovered that the economics of integration didn't work the way the model said they would and are quietly positioning for exit. Not failed exit necessarily, the certificates, customer relationships, and aircraft they've assembled still have real value, but a strategic recognition that the bet they made on scale efficiencies and demand durability hasn't played out the way the deal thesis assumed, and that a larger, better capitalized buyer or a different ownership structure is ultimately a better answer than continuing to try to make the current structure work. The next wave of transactions in this market, whenever it comes, will include some of these operators, and the prices those deals happen at will be a fascinating indicator of how the market has marked down the value of distressed charter platform acquisitions versus clean strategic ones. Let me step back from the specific operator dynamics for a moment and talk about what all of this means for the actual consumers of charter services, because this is not just a story about finance and deal structure. It has direct implications for what the charter market looks like to the customer who's actually calling to book a flight. The consolidation wave was sold, in part, on the promise that larger operators would bring better service consistency, more transparent pricing, better safety management, and more reliable aircraft availability than the fragmented small operator market it was replacing. The degree to which that promise has actually been delivered is genuinely mixed. On the safety management side, there's a real case to be made that the larger consolidated operators have brought meaningful improvements. Sophisticated safety management systems, more structured approach to recurrent training, better standardization of procedures, and the financial resources to stay ahead of maintenance rather than deferring it are all genuine advantages that scale enables. And operators who've built those capabilities deserve credit for it. On the pricing transparency side, the record is more complicated. The consolidation was supposed to reduce the wild variability in pricing that characterized the fragmented market, where a savvy customer could shop around and find dramatically different prices for comparable legs from competing operators. What actually happened, in many markets, is that consolidation reduced the number of competing bidders for a given trip, without necessarily producing the pricing discipline that competition provides. And some customers have experienced the consolidated market as being both less transparent and less competitive than the fragmented market it replaced, which is not the consumer benefit the consolidation narrative advertised. On service consistency, the results vary enormously by operator and market. The best integrated consolidators have genuinely delivered more consistent service experiences than the patchwork of small regional operators they replaced, with better dispatch communication, more reliable aircraft substitution when a mechanical event would otherwise ground a flight, and more professional customer-facing processes. The worst integrated ones have delivered worse experiences than the small operators they acquired, because the personal relationships and founder-level attention that characterize those small operators have been replaced by corporate processes that haven't yet reached the level of maturity that makes them genuinely better than what they replaced. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because the consolidation wave is over, but the landscape it created is still very much in motion. The most important dynamic to watch in the post-consolidation charter market is what happens to fleet values over the next 18 to 36 months, because those values are the foundation of the balance sheet math for every operator who leveraged aircraft to finance their consolidation activity. The used business jet market has been in a meaningful correction from peak, with inventory levels rising from the historic lows of the pandemic era, days to sale metrics extending, and pricing in many categories coming off peak by 20, 30, in some cases more than 30% depending on type and vintage. If that correction continues to the point where aircraft values fall below the loan-to-value thresholds built into charter operators' secured financing, you start to see forced events, additional equity requirements, asset sales on unfavorable terms, or in the worst cases, lender-driven restructurings that remove the existing equity holders and find new management for the certificate and fleet. None of those outcomes are good for the operators carrying the most acquisition leverage, and the probability of seeing some version of that scenario play out for at least a portion of the consolidation era acquirers has increased meaningfully as the market has continued to correct. The second dynamic to watch is what happens with charter demand through a potential economic softening. The customer base that charter has gained since the pandemic includes a genuinely sticky core, frequent travelers who made the switch from commercial and have built charter into their regular travel pattern in a way that's unlikely to fully reverse. But it also includes a larger discretionary flyer segment that chartered during the pandemic for reasons that had more to do with commercial avoidance than genuine conversion to the charter lifestyle, and that segment is already showing signs of drifting back to commercial alternatives as the commercial product has recovered and the price differential has become more salient in a tighter consumer spending environment. How much of that discretionary demand erodes in an economic slowdown, and which operators are exposed to it versus the stickier frequent flyer base, will be a major determinant of which of the consolidation survivors end up in the genuinely strong position, and which end up needing to renegotiate with their lenders. The third dynamic, and in some ways the most interesting from a long-term structural standpoint, is what happens to the small and mid-size regional operators who either chose not to sell during the consolidation wave or couldn't find a buyer at a price they found acceptable. Some of these operators are in a surprisingly good competitive position right now, precisely because they didn't take on the acquisition debt and integration costs that their consolidated competitors are managing. A lean, well-run 10-aircraft regional operation with a strong local customer base and no acquisition debt is carrying fixed costs that are meaningfully lower per flight hour than many of the consolidation-era acquirers are dealing with. And in markets where a personal relationship with a known and trusted operator still drives booking decisions, these independent operators have retained more market share than the consolidation thesis predicted. Whether those independents can maintain that position as the consolidated operators get their integration costs under control and start competing more aggressively on both price and product is the open question. The consolidation thesis was, fundamentally, that scale creates durable economic advantages in this business, in crew training efficiency, in maintenance purchasing power, in technology platform amortization, in brand marketing reach. If those scale advantages materialize as the integrated operators get past the integration turbulence, the competitive pressure on independents will increase substantially. If the integrated operators remain high cost and tactically distracted by their own balance sheet management for several more years, the independents will have a window to consolidate their customer bases and potentially make targeted hires from the talent that's been churned out by the larger operators' integration struggles. For buyers of charter services, businesses, high-net-worth individuals, the genuinely wide range of customers that the post-pandemic market has developed, the most practical implication of everything we've walked through today is that the charter market you're buying from in 2025 and beyond looks fundamentally different from the one that existed 5 years ago, in ways that should affect how you shop, how you structure your charter relationships, and how much you think about operator financial health as a variable in your purchasing decision. The days when every regional charter market had 5 to 8 legitimate competing operators bidding for your business are largely over in most markets. The number of independent operators who can bid on a given leg with their own aircraft and their own certificates has shrunk, and the market share concentration in most regions has increased substantially. That's not necessarily bad if the surviving consolidated operators are delivering better service, safety, and reliability. Concentration can coexist with a better customer outcome. But if you're used to a genuinely competitive multi-bidder dynamic to keep prices honest, you need to understand that dynamic has changed, and building your charter purchasing strategy around it has become more important, not less, in a more concentrated market. The other practical implication for buyers is around deposit and advance payment exposure. In a market where some of the consolidation-era acquirers are carrying genuinely stressed balance sheets, the question of what happens to your advance payments if an operator has a liquidity event has become more relevant than it was when the market was booming and everyone looked healthy. The deposit protection structures that some but not all operators provide, escrow arrangements, credit card payments that preserve chargeback rights, charter broker relationships that include their own financial vetting of the operators they book, have moved from being nice-to-have features to being genuinely worth asking about before you send a wire to a charter operator you haven't flown with before, particularly for large advance payments on future trips. Let me bring this back to the headline one more time, because I don't want the complexity of everything we've walked through to bury the core of what this story actually is. The charter operator consolidation wave is over. The acquisitions that were going to happen have largely happened. The capital that was going to deploy into this space has largely deployed. And what we're left with is a landscape of surviving operators who paid, in aggregate, a genuinely steep price to build the fleets and customer bases they now control. Steep in the headline acquisition multiples they paid at peak cycle valuations, steep in the integration costs they absorbed, steep in the crew and customer churn they managed through, and steep in the ongoing cost of servicing the debt loads that financed the whole thing on the back of asset values that have since corrected. The survivors who came through that process with genuinely strong competitive positions are the ones who combined valuation discipline with integration excellence and customer retention focus from the start. The ones who are still managing the legacy costs of aggressive peak cycle acquisitions have a harder road ahead of them, and the next round of transactions in this market will tell us which ones found their way to genuinely stable ground, and which ones ultimately couldn't close the gap between what they paid to build their fleets and what those fleets can actually generate under normalized demand